My beloved child, something unexpected happened the moment that $500 payment was placed on the psychic's table, because the third party arrived believing this would be simple: one private session, one symbolic ritual, one attempt to help your soulmate finally loosen the emotional connection they still carried toward you. But the psychic had barely begun listening when her expression changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone could easily explain. She simply became quiet, looked down at the money, and asked a question the third party had never prepared to answer. Why are you trying so hard to erase someone who is not asking to be remembered? That sentence altered the atmosphere immediately, because until that moment, the third party had been convinced that you were somehow holding your soulmate in place. They believed your soulmate kept thinking about you because of unfinished conversations, old memories, or emotional habits that could eventually be interrupted. But what unfolded inside that quiet room suggested something far more human, and far more difficult to remove. Your soulmate was not trapped by you. They were remembering how they felt when they were around you. And those are two completely different things. Don't skip, because the reason the psychic eventually pushed that money back across the table had almost nothing to do with magic and everything to do with a realization nobody in that room expected. The third party had arrived carrying details: your name, fragments of your history, things your soulmate had apparently said when they thought nobody was paying close attention. There was one sentence in particular that kept returning. Your soulmate had once said, almost casually, "I don't miss the past. I miss who I was when that person understood me." The third party had heard those words and interpreted them as a problem. The psychic heard them and interpreted them as a clue. She asked whether your soulmate had been happier lately, and the third party hesitated. She asked whether they seemed emotionally present, and another hesitation followed. Then came the question that made the room unusually still: when they speak about this person, do they sound obsessed, or do they sound peaceful? The answer mattered. Because your soulmate had never been describing you with chaos. They had been describing you with a strange softness, the kind people sometimes carry when remembering someone who saw beneath their defenses without forcing them to explain every hidden part of themselves. That was when the third party started to realize this session was moving in a direction they had never intended. They had paid for forgetting. Instead, they were being asked why forgetting had become so important to them. And beneath all the explanations was something simpler: comparison. Your soulmate had been trying to move forward. They had tried distractions, new routines, longer days, different conversations, even moments when they convinced themselves that what they felt for you had finally become small enough to ignore. Yet every time life became quiet, your memory returned not as an interruption, but as a reference point. Something important is waiting for you here, because the story is not about someone being unable to live without you. It is about what happens when a person finally recognizes the difference between missing attention and missing genuine understanding. Your soulmate could find attention elsewhere. They could find laughter elsewhere. They could even find companionship elsewhere. But there was one experience they had quietly associated with you that had proven much harder to reproduce: the feeling of being understood without performing. That realization was what began breaking through the third party's certainty. The psychic did not promise to bring anyone back. She did not claim the future was fixed. She simply placed your name beside your soulmate's name on a blank sheet of paper and asked the third party to describe what they believed needed to disappear. The memories, came the first answer. Which memories? Silence. The feelings. Which feelings? Another silence. Then, almost reluctantly, the third party admitted what they actually wanted gone, the comparison. And there it was. The real reason $500 had been placed on that table. It was never just about making your soulmate forget a person. It was about making them forget the standard of emotional connection that person had quietly become. Stay till the end, because what happened next softened even the psychic's voice. She asked about the last time your soulmate mentioned you, and the third party described a small moment from only days earlier. Nothing dramatic had happened. Your soulmate had been sitting with their phone nearby when a familiar song began playing somewhere in the background. They stopped moving for a second. Not because the song belonged to you, but because it reminded them of an ordinary evening the two of you had once shared, an evening so simple that nobody else would have considered it important. There had been no grand confession. No perfect romantic scene. You had simply noticed they were unusually quiet and asked, "Do you want me to listen, or do you want me to help?" Your soulmate apparently remembered that question word for word. And the psychic understood why. You had given them something rare in that moment, a choice. You had not forced them to open up. You had not made their silence about yourself. You had made room for them. That small memory had survived longer than many louder ones because it represented something your soulmate had only recently learned to name: emotional safety. The third party looked away when this was explained, because suddenly the entire situation seemed different. You were not occupying your soulmate's mind through some mysterious force. You had simply left behind memories attached to sincerity, and sincerity does not disappear because someone demands it. The psychic reached for the $500. The third party thought the session was finally about to begin. Instead, she slid every dollar back. "I can't take this for what you're asking," she said quietly. The third party stared at the money without touching it. Why? And this is where the story changed. The psychic did not answer immediately. Her eyes had become wet, not because she had seen something frightening, but because the conversation had reminded her of something deeply personal: how often people try to erase feelings before understanding what those feelings are trying to teach them. She looked toward the third party and said, "You're asking me to remove a memory when what needs attention is the truth underneath it." That was the moment tears appeared. Not dramatic tears. Not defeat. Something closer to recognition. Because the third party finally understood that competing with your memory had been keeping everyone emotionally stuck. The harder they tried to make your soulmate forget you, the more significant you seemed to become. Every question about you brought another memory forward. Every comparison gave your absence more weight. Every attempt to prove that you did not matter forced your soulmate to privately examine why you still did. And in that examination, they had begun discovering something they had avoided for a long time. Perhaps what they felt was never about needing you to rescue them, complete them, or return immediately. Perhaps it was about finally admitting that the connection had changed them. You had shown them how deeply they wanted honesty. How much they valued gentleness. How different love felt when they did not have to pretend. And once a person learns those things about themselves, they cannot simply unlearn them. But there was another detail one the third party had not told the psychic at the beginning. A message existed. Your soulmate had written it recently and never sent it. The third party knew about it only because your soulmate had mentioned deleting and rewriting the same words several times. Nobody knew exactly what the full message said. Only its opening sentence had been revealed. And when the psychic heard those first few words, she stopped wiping her tears and looked directly at the third party. Because suddenly, the $500, the attempted forgetting, the comparisons, and all those quiet memories seemed to point toward one unresolved truth. Your soulmate was not trying to decide whether you mattered. They had already answered that privately. They were trying to decide what to do with the fact that you still mattered while respecting everything that had happened between you. That is a much more delicate question. A much more mature one. And perhaps that is why nothing could be rushed. Sometimes the most meaningful shift does not happen when someone runs back dramatically. It happens when they stop running from what they already know. Somewhere inside your soulmate, that shift had begun. They were no longer asking, "How do I forget?" They were asking, "Why did this connection affect me so deeply, and what am I supposed to learn from it?" The psychic returned the money because she could not ethically promise to erase another person's authentic emotions. Then she gathered her things, paused at the doorway, and said one final sentence that the third party would remember long after leaving that room: "If you truly care about them, stop asking them to forget. Give them enough space to understand." And strangely, those words did not feel like a loss. They felt like permission. Permission for the third party to stop competing. Permission for your soulmate to stop pretending. And perhaps, quietly, permission for you to stop wondering whether every meaningful connection must immediately prove itself through action. Some truths reveal themselves first through stillness. Some feelings become clearer only when nobody is forcing an outcome. And this story has reached that kind of silence now, because after the psychic left crying and the refunded money remained untouched on the table, the third party did something nobody expected. They contacted your soulmate, but not to mention the psychic, not to argue about you, and not to demand another choice. They asked one simple question. Your soulmate read it. Stayed silent for several minutes. Then opened the unsent message they had written about you. And the line they finally added beneath that unfinished confession changed the meaning of everything that had happened so far. The strangest part was not the sentence your soulmate added, it was what they deleted first. For several minutes, they sat staring at that unfinished message, reading words they had written during different emotional moments, some hopeful, some uncertain, some clearly written when they were trying to convince themselves they had already moved on. The third party's question remained glowing on the screen: if nobody was asking you to choose anything right now, what would you finally admit to yourself? Your soulmate read it again. Then again. And something inside them seemed to become quieter. They removed an entire paragraph from the message to you. It had been filled with explanations, reasons, careful defenses, all the things people write when they are afraid their simplest truth will not be enough. What remained afterward was surprisingly small. Your name. A few honest sentences. And then the new line: I kept trying to forget you when what I really needed was to understand why being known by you changed me. Your soulmate did not send it. Not yet. And that hesitation matters more than it might seem. Because this was no longer the hesitation of someone denying what they felt. It was the hesitation of someone beginning to respect the weight of what they wanted to say. For the first time, they were asking whether contacting you would come from clarity or loneliness, from sincerity or impulse, from genuine readiness or simply the discomfort of missing something meaningful. Don't skip, because the answer they arrived at was not what the third party expected, and strangely, it was not what your soulmate expected either. They realized they had spent months treating your memory like a problem that needed solving. Every time you crossed their mind, they tried to replace the thought. Every time an old conversation returned, they looked for a distraction. Every time they remembered the way you understood something nobody else noticed, they told themselves they were romanticizing the past. But now they were beginning to see another possibility. Maybe memory was not asking them to go backward. Maybe it was showing them what they needed to carry forward. There is a difference. A powerful one. And your soulmate finally felt it. They remembered how you used to notice the subtle changes in their voice. How you could tell when "I'm fine" meant "I don't know how to explain this yet." How you sometimes gave them room instead of demanding answers. Those memories had survived because they were connected to lessons about the kind of relationship they actually wanted, not perfection, not endless intensity, not someone who could read their mind, but someone with whom honesty felt possible. And suddenly the question was no longer, "Why can't I forget this person?" It became, "Why did I ever think forgetting was the goal?" That realization landed softly, but it changed everything. Your soulmate locked their phone, stood up, walked toward the window, and remained there in complete silence. The third party watched from across the room, expecting perhaps anger when the truth about the psychic finally came out. Instead, something much more uncomfortable happened. Your soulmate asked, "Why did you think I needed help forgetting them?" There was no accusation in the question. That made it harder to answer. The third party began explaining the distance they had noticed, the moments your soulmate seemed emotionally elsewhere, the way your name appeared in conversations even when nobody intended to mention you. But underneath every explanation was a quieter confession. They had become afraid that no matter what they offered, they were standing beside someone whose heart was still measuring certain experiences against what they had once felt with you. Your soulmate listened without interrupting. Then came a response that changed the emotional balance in the room. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you were competing with a memory." That sentence was gentle enough to break through every defense. Notice what your soulmate did not say. They did not deny your importance. They did not pretend the connection had meant nothing. But neither did they use their feelings for you as an excuse to disregard another person's emotions. Something had matured inside them. They were beginning to understand that acknowledging one truth did not require hurting someone else, and perhaps this was the deeper reason the psychic had refused that $500. The real transformation could never come from forcing someone to forget. It had to come from everyone becoming honest about what they were actually holding. The third party finally revealed the entire story: the appointment, the payment, the request, the refunded money, even the psychic leaving with tears in her eyes. Your soulmate listened in disbelief at first, but then their expression changed when they heard the psychic's final advice: give them enough space to understand. Something about those words reached a place nothing else had reached. Because space had been the one thing your soulmate kept fighting. Whenever silence appeared between you, they interpreted it as loss. Whenever time passed, they assumed they needed to either fix everything immediately or bury everything completely. There had been no middle ground. No quiet place where feelings could simply exist long enough to reveal what they meant. Stay till the end, because that middle ground became the doorway to the next realization. Your soulmate opened the unsent message again, but instead of adding another emotional declaration, they wrote something almost painfully simple: "I don't want to come back into your life carrying the same confusion I left with." Then they stopped. That sentence frightened them in a different way because it made one truth unavoidable: that if they ever reached toward you again, they wanted to arrive differently. Not with promises they had not earned. Not with dramatic explanations. Not expecting you to immediately understand everything they had only just begun understanding themselves. They wanted to know whether they could offer you the same emotional safety they remembered receiving from you. And suddenly, the entire connection looked different through their eyes. They remembered moments when you had needed reassurance and they had withdrawn. Times when you tried to explain something gently and they became defensive because the truth felt too close. Moments when you were asking for presence while they were protecting themselves with silence. These memories did not make them collapse into guilt. They created responsibility. And responsibility, when it is genuine, can become something beautiful. It can turn regret into growth instead of self-punishment. It can turn longing into clarity instead of obsession. Your soulmate began asking themselves a question they had avoided because it required more courage than simply saying, "I miss you." They asked, "If this person ever trusted me again, what would I do differently?" Something important is waiting for you in that question. Because missing someone is easy compared with becoming capable of meeting them differently. Anyone can revisit memories. Anyone can feel emotional when a familiar song plays. But growth asks for something more. It asks whether the person who returns is bringing new awareness or merely old feelings. Your soulmate understood that distinction now. And that was when the third party did something even more surprising than visiting the psychic. They encouraged your soulmate not to send the message yet. For a second, your soulmate thought they had misunderstood. But the third party repeated it: "Don't send it until you know what you're offering them besides words." There was no bitterness left in the sentence. Only tired honesty. Perhaps the psychic's refusal had changed them too. Perhaps being forced to confront their own fear of comparison made them realize that holding someone close through pressure could never create the security they were searching for. In one quiet afternoon, 3 people had stopped trying to control an outcome. And strangely, that was when the story finally began moving forward. Your soulmate saved the message as a draft and did something far less dramatic but far more meaningful. They began writing a second note, a note they had no intention of sending you. At the top they wrote, "What I learned from loving you." The first line came easily: "I learned that being understood feels different from being admired." Then another: "I learned that silence can either protect love or slowly distance it." Then, "I learned that I expected you to understand feelings I was too afraid to explain." Your soulmate stared at that last sentence for a long time. Because there it was, the piece they had never admitted. They had sometimes expected your intuition to replace their communication. When you failed to know what they had never told you, they quietly felt disappointed. When you asked direct questions, they sometimes pulled away because honesty made them feel exposed. Yet they still remembered you as the person who understood them most. How unfair that must have been at times. How human, too. That recognition softened something inside them. For the first time, they stopped remembering your connection only through the beautiful moments and began seeing the full picture: the tenderness, the misunderstanding, the closeness, the distance, the things both of you may have handled well and the things that might have needed more maturity. And somehow, seeing it realistically made the connection feel more meaningful, not less. Because real love does not become valuable by pretending everything was perfect. Sometimes its deepest value appears when people understand what the experience taught them. Night had begun settling outside by the time your soulmate reached the bottom of that private note. They had written far more than expected. The third party had already left, carrying the refunded $500 and a very different understanding of why this situation could never be solved through competition. Your soulmate remained alone with the unfinished message to you. They opened it one final time. Their finger hovered over the send button. For several seconds, it seemed as though this would finally be the moment. But then they smiled faintly and closed the screen. Not because they had changed their mind about you. Because something stronger than urgency had appeared: patience. They wanted their next action to match what they had just learned. And that meant allowing one night to pass without forcing anything. Yet shortly before sleeping, something unexpected appeared on their phone. Not a message from you. Not another message from the third party. It was an old photograph that surfaced automatically from years or perhaps months earlier, depending on the history the two of you share. The photograph itself was ordinary. But there was something visible in the corner that your soulmate had never noticed before. Something connected to the exact conversation they had been remembering all afternoon. They enlarged the image once. Then twice. And when they finally understood what they were looking at, they whispered your name, not with sadness, but with a stunned kind of recognition. Because hidden inside that ordinary photograph was proof that one of the most meaningful things they remembered about you had actually begun much earlier than they thought, and what they discovered next would completely change the message they were preparing to send. At first, your soulmate thought the detail in the photograph meant nothing. It was small, almost hidden near the edge of the frame, the kind of thing anyone could overlook when their attention was focused on faces, smiles, and whatever moment had originally been captured. But the longer they stared, the more their breathing slowed. There, beside you, was something they suddenly remembered with startling clarity: a folded piece of paper, partly visible beneath your hand. They knew that paper. Not because they had ever read it, but because they remembered asking you about it that day. You had brushed the question aside gently, saying it was nothing important. Back then, your soulmate accepted the answer. Tonight, however, the memory reopened with completely different meaning. Because only minutes after that photograph had been taken, the two of you had shared one of those quiet conversations that somehow remained inside them long after louder moments faded. You had asked what they wanted most from the next chapter of their life. They had answered quickly, something about peace, stability, maybe finally becoming the person they kept promising themselves they would become. Then you had smiled in that particular way they still remembered and said, "Then don't build a life that requires you to hide from yourself." At the time, your soulmate thought you were simply offering encouragement. Now those words landed differently. Don't skip, because the piece of paper in that photograph was about to connect the past to something your soulmate had only understood today. They searched through old messages, not looking for romance, not trying to reopen every memory, but looking for one conversation that had followed that photograph. It took longer than expected. There were ordinary exchanges, forgotten jokes, small plans that never happened, and simple messages that suddenly felt strangely intimate because neither of you knew, when writing them, how important some of those moments would eventually become. Then they found it. A message from you sent later that same evening. I wrote down what I wanted to tell you because I didn't know if I'd have the courage to say it out loud. Your soulmate froze. They had responded back then with something playful, almost dismissive. So what did the mysterious note say? You had replied, maybe one day I'll tell you. That was all. No dramatic reveal. No follow-up. Life simply moved forward. But tonight, after the psychic, after the refunded money, after the third party's unexpected honesty, that unfinished exchange felt almost impossible to ignore. Your soulmate began wondering whether the note had been about them. Then another possibility appeared. Perhaps the note had been about you, about something you were trying to understand within yourself. And strangely, that possibility touched them even more deeply. Because for so long they had been remembering you only through the ways you had understood them. They had rarely stopped to wonder what you might have been carrying silently while making space for their feelings. That realization changed the emotional direction again. Instead of asking, "What did you feel about me?" your soulmate began asking, "What were you trying to say that I may not have been ready to hear?" Stay till the end, because this question led them back to a moment they had misunderstood for far too long. There had been an evening when you suddenly became quieter than usual. Your soulmate remembered noticing, but instead of asking what was happening beneath your silence, they assumed you needed distance. So they gave it. At the time, they believed they were respecting you. But now another detail surfaced. Just before becoming quiet, you had said, "Sometimes I wish I didn't always have to be the strong one in the conversation." Your soulmate remembered hearing the sentence, but not understanding it. They had thought you were speaking generally. Tonight, they realized you may have been speaking directly to them. The insight did not arrive as self-blame. It arrived as tenderness. Perhaps you had also wanted to be seen without having to explain everything perfectly. Perhaps while your soulmate remembered you as the safe place, you had sometimes been waiting for them to create safety for you too. Something important is waiting for you here, because this was the moment the entire story stopped being about whether your soulmate could forget you. It became about whether they could finally remember you accurately. Not as an ideal. Not as someone who never needed anything. Not as a mysterious person who somehow knew exactly what to say. But as another human being who may have loved, hoped, hesitated, protected themselves, and occasionally waited for reassurance too. That recognition was more powerful than nostalgia because nostalgia only preserves the parts we want to revisit. Understanding asks us to see the whole person. Your soulmate returned to the unsent message and read the line they had written earlier. "I don't want to come back into your life carrying the same confusion I left with." For the first time, the sentence felt incomplete. They added another line beneath it, "And I don't want to remember you only for what you gave me. I want to understand what I failed to give you." Their eyes remained on those words for a long time. This was different from longing. Different from regret. It felt like accountability without punishment, care without demand, love without possession. Somewhere far away from that quiet room, the third party was experiencing a transformation of their own. The refunded $500 remained inside an envelope they had not opened since leaving the psychic. What had once represented an attempt to control someone else's feelings now felt almost embarrassing. Yet instead of becoming bitter, they made an unexpected decision. They wrote down the psychic's final sentence, "Give them enough space to understand." Then they placed the note beside the envelope and chose not to contact your soulmate again that night. That silence mattered. Because for once, nobody was pulling your soulmate toward a decision. Nobody was asking them to forget. Nobody was asking them to return. Nobody was asking them to prove anything. And within that quiet freedom, their feelings began becoming clearer. They thought about you not as a destination they had to reach immediately, but as someone they might one day speak to with more honesty than before. They imagined what such a conversation would actually sound like. There would be no dramatic entrance, no perfect speech, no assumption that time had frozen while both of you were apart. They would need to ask how you had been, and genuinely listen to the answer. They would need to accept that you may have changed. They would need to understand that caring about someone does not entitle a person to immediate access to their life. And strangely, those realities did not discourage them. They made the possibility feel more meaningful because it would require respect. Your soulmate opened the draft once more. Their finger moved toward the send button, then stopped again. But this time, they did not close the message. They edited it. They removed the lines that sounded too certain about what you might still feel. They deleted a sentence that assumed you had been waiting. They changed another that accidentally placed responsibility for their happiness on you. What remained was simpler, quieter, and far more sincere. "I've been thinking about some things I didn't understand when we were close. I'm not reaching out to ask anything from you. I just realized there are things I would like to acknowledge properly, whenever and if that ever feels comfortable for you." Your soulmate read it several times. Something about the words felt different from every version before. There was no hidden demand inside them. No attempt to create urgency. No expectation that one message could repair an entire history. Just honesty and room. That was exactly what you had once given them. And perhaps this was the first evidence that they had actually learned something from losing access to that kind of understanding. But then another unexpected detail entered the story. While reviewing the old conversation about the folded note in the photograph, your soulmate noticed a message they had somehow forgotten completely. It had been sent by you the following morning. Only 6 words long. "I think you understood more yesterday." They stared at it. What had you meant? Their old response had been nothing more than a confused emoji, and apparently the subject had never returned. But now the sentence felt connected to everything. The note. Your comment about not wanting to be the strong one. The conversation about building a life that did not require hiding. There was clearly something your soulmate had almost understood that day, and then allowed to disappear beneath ordinary life. They began reconstructing the memory piece by piece. You had seemed nervous when the photograph was taken. You had kept folding and unfolding that paper. Later, you had asked them a strangely specific question: Do you think two people can care deeply about each other and still misunderstand what the other person needs? Your soulmate remembered laughing softly and answering, probably. People are complicated. You had nodded, but your expression had changed. Now, years or months later, they finally heard the unanswered question behind your question. Maybe you had not been discussing people in general. Maybe you had been asking about the two of you. That realization settled over them with incredible gentleness. Perhaps the connection had not failed because either person felt too little. Perhaps sometimes both people had simply been protecting themselves in different ways. One waited to be asked. The other waited to be told. One showed love through understanding. The other assumed that understanding meant words were unnecessary. Both cared. Both missed signals. Both probably carried versions of the same confusion. Your soulmate smiled sadly, but the sadness did not remain for long. Because this interpretation offered something valuable, not a guarantee of reunion, but freedom from the simplistic story that somebody must have been the villain and somebody else the victim. Sometimes meaningful relationships become complicated because two imperfect people are trying to love while still learning how to communicate. And learning that does not erase what happened. It simply gives the past a more honest shape. Your soulmate looked at the draft again, and for the first time that night, they stopped thinking about whether you would answer. They thought about whether the message itself respected you. That distinction was everything. They made one final change: you don't owe me a response. Then they placed the phone down. Not because they had decided never to send it. Not because courage had disappeared. But because they wanted to sleep on it one more night and make sure the words still felt sincere in the morning. And this is where something almost beautifully ordinary happened. Your soulmate finally slept peacefully. No endless replaying. No attempt to force an outcome. No argument with themselves about whether they should forget you or reach for you. Just rest. Morning arrived softer than expected. Sunlight entered the room, the unfinished message remained exactly where they had left it, and for several minutes your soulmate did not touch the phone at all. They made coffee, stood near the same window, and noticed how different everything felt when urgency was gone. Then the phone vibrated. Once. Your soulmate glanced down casually, assuming it was something unimportant. But their expression changed the instant they saw the notification. It was not from the third party. It was not from the psychic. And it was not from you. It came from someone connected to the old photograph, someone who had been there that day and apparently remembered the folded note far better than your soulmate did. The message contained only one sentence: I found something yesterday that I think was meant for you a long time ago. Beneath those words was a photograph of an envelope. Your soulmate enlarged the image, and there, written across the front in handwriting they recognized immediately, was their name. Your handwriting. And suddenly, the unsent message on their phone no longer felt like the only unfinished message between the two of you.